how's it felt coming back here then?
It's nice.
Your mum is incredible though, isn't she?
Yeah,
I mean,
she's the
literally,
best.
she would bring you to the hospital, not have a bed to sleep in.
No.
Not have money for the parking.
No. I don't know how she did it. Like, I honestly think back to it now and I think, like, now being a mum and seeing it from a different kind of view, like, I'm like, how did she do that? When I was getting looked after, I was a little girl and I haven't seen these people for years, but I literally think about them every day, all the time. Me and my mum always talk about Miss Lawson, the nurses. Like, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here.
I've got a surprise for you.
What is it?
Mrs. Lawson's here.
No, she's not. She retired ages ago.
Yeah, she is.
Didn't she?
She's here.
What do you mean?
Hiya, Perrie. Oh, hello. Oh, no, sneaky.
Sorry, I feel really emotional.
They are so sneaky. They're really hiding outside.
Oh my gosh, you look great. You look exactly the same. Oh, you've aged like a fine wine. Oh my gosh.
Where's your mum? He's like, come and sit down. Come and say hello. Hello.
Oh my God, that's so cute.
Good to see you. Sorry. Now we'll all have to go and have a hanky break, won't we?
It's so good to see you.
Hello, Mrs. Lawson. I'm very well. Lovely to meet you.
Oh my God, Alison. This is Alison.
Ignoring you. Sorry, hello. It's so nice to meet you.
Oh,
Miss Lawson's come to see you. Why do you think you're so emotional?
I think just because I haven't seen you for years, I think I'm just so grateful for you. Like, obviously, me and my mum, it was really hard.
Oh, Mrs.
And we saw a lot of each other, didn't we?
did.
Far too much of each other.
But that's the thing, like, if it wasn't for you, I honestly don't think I would be here. Because I think, obviously, before I met you, nobody knew what was wrong with me.
Because they thought it was psychological, didn't they? And your mum always knew it wasn't psychological.
Yeah, and they're like, it was a wild ride, but it was the best experience ever getting to meet you and being looked after by you. So,
Mrs. Lawson, I can't believe she went through that amount of time and it being misdiagnosed.
The important thing was Perrie knew she was hungry, because didn't you used to eat a whole family trifle?
Yeah, a whole family trifle.
Like,
How do you remember that?
Because I used that with other kids. When they said, oh, I'm hungry and I can't, I said, whole family trifle.
Like a family size.
And you could swap
because
the whole
if you think
thing
about
out.
it, it's soft jelly, cream and biscuits
And it
that
just
have gone
goes
soft
down.
and it just goes down a treat.
Because she needed the calories, because
Yeah.
she was hungry,
Yeah.
but she couldn't take anything that you had to swallow lumps, you see. I must have first met you in, like, the November, December.
It was just before Christmas.
Because I said, I think we could just squeeze her in before Christmas and then she could have a Christmas dinner. And your mum said, well, she's never had one yet, so she's not... Oh, dear, I've made her cry. You'd never had one, had you?
Why I love Christmas dinner. That is so funny. Christmas dinner's like my favourite thing.
Mrs. Lawson, thank you so much.
No,
for
it's
everything
been
you've done.
lovely. It's so nice to see you.